Hello, guys. Thanks for joining me today. Grey Matter, Ancient, Mike. Good to see you all here. This space, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Queen Mother of the West or Siwangmu, but it's basically an ancient mythological Chinese character. And I've been doing some research into her for a separate project. And I thought, why let it go to waste? Why not make a recorded space where I can go over all of the sort of Han Dynasty and earlier sources for her? You do wind up hearing about her in later texts, and she has different titles and much different significance, but I'm not as familiar with all that. So this is strictly going to be Han Dynasty is sort of the cutoff for any text I'm looking at. And really, I'm more interested in the sort of pre-unification. So if any of you are unfamiliar with Chinese history, essentially you have these they're kind of like feudal dynasties or mythological dynasties of Xia and Shang and Zhou. And then you have the spring and autumn period where the Zhou authority is kind of falling apart. Warring states, now these various kingdoms, Zhou has been completely overthrown, and you basically have a whole bunch of warring kingdoms. They've whittled down their numbers by gobbling up each other, and now they're going to unify China under the first emperor, or the one that's most famous for, I think, all of us, Qin Shi Huang, who will Qin Shi Huangdi, and then he will become the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. It's not going to last very long. Then you have the Han dynasty, which is, maybe that's the most famous dynasty of all. It's the second one after Qin, but it lasts a long time. In terms of when it's happening, it's sort of, you know, Qin unifies China after the Warring States at the end of the third century, like 220 something, and BC, and it falls within like a generation or two. It's very quick, and then Han reunifies the pieces and essentially extends from the second century BC all the way through to sort of when you see Rome crumbling. So the time period for these texts I'm looking at, it's basically from late imperial Rome. I'm using Western examples because I think we're all more familiar with that. It's basically from the time period of late imperial Rome, um, all the way back to remotest antiquity. And so I figured if I'm going to be presenting this character to you, Siwangmu, I better kind of describe her in different ways. So we'll go over her name, we'll go over where she could be found, we'll go over how she appears or like what her characteristics are in terms of appearance, what she wears, what she can do, um, and then finally how she interacts with people. And I think what we'll find is in the earliest texts, she's much different than what we see in the Han era texts, and much, much different from what comes after that, at least in my impression. Again, I'm not as familiar with what happens after the end of Han or the late Imperial Roman period. And so it's sort of funny when you read these ancient Chinese texts and then you encounter someone talking about the modern, the more modern, or maybe even just the medieval Chinese accounts of it. There's a lot of differences that crop up. So hopefully in this talk we'll sort of notice a lot of differences in how the Queen Mother of the West develops. So I'll start out with the name. Essentially, the name it's always translated in all of the English works I see as Queen Mother of the West, and having grown up myself with a monarch, the Queen Mother was the mother of the Queen. So sort of you interpret it almost as Queen Mother of the West would be the mother of the reigning monarch and presumably located in the West. But that's not really an accurate translation. It's more like a literal one. So the Chinese name that's in these ancient texts, it's 3 characters long. It's going to be Siwangmu. So it's going to be Western. Si is Western. Wang is a king or a monarch or ruler. And then Mu is going to be mother. And so you can see how they got the name. Basically, Western Queen Mother or Western monarch mother. So I get how they got their name. But this character is not described in these early texts as being the mother of the reigning monarch or something. It's not like that. So there's a bit of inaccuracy, I think, in just saying Queen Mother of the West. Some people also point out that Wang Mu, so Queen Mother, taking off the word West, so just Wang Mu, might mean something like a paternal grandmother who's passed away. So it's like the spirit of the paternal grandmother or spirit of a grandmother. So when they translate it, they might want to translate it as something like the Western grandmother spirit or something like that. But also, I've seen people theorize. Again, this is a very ancient like deity or creature, and so these sources are very old. So people are trying to interpret what they might mean. Another interpretation I see is that Mu, mother, may just be a general statement of being an ancestral authority or ancestral source. So they would almost translate it as the Western royal ancestor, sort of the ancestor of humanity writ large. Um, I'm not saying that I have a particularly strong view on what it could mean. I'm not really that knowledgeable in interpreting all these terms, but those are a few popular alternatives I saw to just saying Queen Mother of the West. And I can definitely see why Queen Mother of the West could be misleading because she's not presented as the mother of the reigning monarch. There's also a little bit of a mystery to the name that I found, just to add to it. The When I said that remotest antiquity was how far I was going back, you might be familiar with oracle bones. Basically, they take turtle shells or the bones of animals, they write things on them, and then they crack them, and then try to read the cracks and decide whether or not it's auspicious or inauspicious. So it's like a divination tool. And those bones or turtle shells get dug up, and people read them. They're extremely old. We're talking Shang Dynasty. Um, Obviously, they do it after that as well, but to put it in a Western context, maybe we're talking about the time of, Odysseus and Agamemnon and Achilles and all that. This sort of very remote period in time. And so the on those shells or on those bones, they've also found two characters next to each other, Simu. So the Wang is gone, the king or queen is gone, but it says Western Mother, and they believe it to be some sort of deity. And so their interpretation is maybe Simu is Siwangmu, and somehow the name has changed over time when we get to the period where we're getting all these texts rather than just bones. And to give you a better understanding of what the bones are like, it's again, I haven't been going around reading oracle bones or shells, but it'll start with something like on Tuesday we did some divination, and then it'll have the question. It'll be something like, "We're going to go hunting. Are we going to catch a lot of animals?" And then the next will say, "We cracked the bone. We're reading the result. It looked good." And then the last thing will be something along the lines of, "Hey, it was right. It really was good. We caught these animals." And then I guess they bury the bones because someone came and dug them up. So you have a character called Simu on those bones, and whether that's Siwangmu, the character we're talking about, I don't know, but some people interpret it that way, and I think that's a popular interpretation. So we got her name. I think the next thing is if we're going to find her, we should know where she is. Um, Essentially, the oldest source for where she lives or exists is in a text called the Shanhai Jing, or like the classic of the mountains and rivers or seas. It's basically like I don't want to say it's an atlas, but it's a description. It's actually a bunch of different texts put together, and it just describes the world. It'd be like if you travel 50 miles that way, you'll reach this place, and that's what's there. And if you travel another 50 miles that way, you'll reach this place, and that's what's there. But it's also a very fun text because it's full of sort of mythological creatures and all sorts of wild things. Because again, this is a very ancient text. People date it from different periods, but let's just say that it's going to be around the time of, you know, golden age of Greece or Hellenistic period, or maybe sometime in the Roman period, or maybe bits of it are in one part of time and bits of this text are in another time period. Because you'll find with a lot of these Chinese texts as well, they get amalgamated in the Han Dynasty. So you'll have like a bunch of different texts, and someone will say, "Let's put them all together." Maybe he has a good reason or not, but the point is, some of these texts are an amalgamation. The Shanhai Jing is an amalgamation of multiple texts. And if we want to pick the earliest dating, then we're probably going to date this to, yeah, probably the 5th century BC or 4th century BC. It's probably going to be the Peloponnesian War period. Maybe this is being written when Plato's alive. But basically, the Shanhai Jing is the ancient most source for where Siwangmu is going to be living. And it's saying that she's on a mountain. It's called Jade Mountain, or on a mountain known for jade. And she's also, I'll give you a general layout. She's going to be living in a mountain range. She's going to be near some rivers. It's the far west of ancient China. It's on Mount Jade, per the Shanhai Jing, which we know to be just north of Mount Kun, which is another famous mountain, or Kunlun. And she's, generally she's associated with that remote western mountain area. There are some other ancient sources. You can look at the Arya, or dictionary. It has a section discussing the world, and it puts her on the westernmost wasteland. So again, she's way out west, and she's in the mountains. There's jade there, and it's basically universal, except one example I found, which had a separate theory about how the world is structured. It's no longer a north, east, southwest system, but actually this other text, it's an amalgamation of multiple texts, and it had this essay in it. And in this essay, it's giving a different theory of the world that says the world is broken into 9 continents. So just think of a grid, like 3 wide, 3 tall, and there's 9 parts of that grid, right? The central grid, there's a continent there. I mean, it's all continents, 9 continents, but the central continent, that is also shaped like a square and also has 9 sections. And so the central section of the central continent, that's where Kunlun mountain range is, or the mountain is. And that's where Siwangmu lives. So you have most sources saying this person is, like, the vast majority are saying she's way out west, and she's in the mountain range. And I'll get into some of the descriptions of what the surrounding area of the mountain range is like, but she's way out west. And then you have this one different theory where actually she's the center of the world, kind of like the stone at Delphi, right? That marks the center of the world, the belly button of the world. Well, Siwangmu is on the mountain that marks the center of the world. And actually, in that model, China is to the southeast. So China is still on the central continent, but it's on the southeast quadrant. So it's in that the bottom right corner of that central continent. So just so Siwangmu would still be to the west or northwest. Some other things that are near her, you'll find there's a lot of rivers. One river is the Liuxia River, so drifting sand, or I've seen people translate it as quicksand. I don't know if it meant quicksand in antiquity, but she's not only by a mountain, but she's by these rivers, one of them which has shifting sand or quicksand. And there are a bunch of other rivers as well right around her. So we have her also in a later text. There are some lakes and things, and there's actually a lake in the Han Dynasty that she's associated with that things can't float on. It's called like the weak waters. So if you put a feather on the water, it would sink. So in terms of her location, if we're going to find her, we're, if we're in China, let's say we're in Luoyang. So basically, if you want Google Maps, type in Luoyang, or you just look at the middle of China or a little bit north of the middle of China, and then you draw a circle around there. These authors are probably living in that region. And then they're going to be thinking of Siwangmu way to the west. So if we're living there in old China, we're going to be traveling way to the west, probably looking at a modern map. Kunlun, it's going to be like a north of Tibet or northwest Tibet, or the southern area of Xinjiang, if you're looking at a modern map. So think about that as sort of where you might find her. And keep in mind, it's going to be up in a mountain. There's going to be drifting sand or quicksand and rivers, and a lot of jade is produced in that region. And I think jade being produced there. Remember, the Shanhai Jing said her mountain is literally called Jade Mountain. This association with jade is important because for ancient China, and I guess for modern Chinese as well, jade is very important. It has special properties. Specifically, jade can help you live longer. Jade could even make you live forever. And what you find in antiquity and burial sites is people dressed in jade. So if we go to remotest antiquity, you're going to have jade bracelets around their wrists. You're going to have jade jewelry and stuff. And then by the time of the Han Dynasty, again, around the time of the Roman Empire, you're going to have people, and you can look it up. There's plenty of these suits in museums and photographed. You can find on the internet. They're dressed head to toe in these very strange jade body bags, almost, or outfits or suits. So just imagine a person in a full suit, but instead of clothing or cloth, it's little tiles of jade. And the jade is stitched together with a gold thread. And so they've literally made themselves like a jade onesie that goes from their feet, so it's also shoes, all the way up to the top of their head, and has a face mask on some of them as well. So they're completely dressed in jade. So jade has a strong association with long life. People would even consume it. They could powder it up. There was one source that said a king had a jade goblet and he would drink powdered jade mixed with like a juice. I don't know if that would actually be healthy for someone. Don't do it. But they were apparently doing it. So jade has a strong association with long life, and I think that's going to be important later when we talk about her appearance and characteristics. And also, jade is extremely valuable and is used for rituals. So we're going to find that a lot of oh yeah, thank you, Mike. I saw you you have a picture of a jade suit there. Yeah, if you tweet that out, I will share it on the jumbotron. I could, but I'm sure everyone can find one as well. But the jade is used in rituals as well. It has a lot of ritual objects are made of jade. So you might see what's called a bee, or it's like a sphere, like a circle. It's like a circle disc made of jade, and it has a hollowed out center. So it's like just like a ring, but a big ring. You wouldn't wear it on your finger. And you could also have like a gui, which is like a stick of jade with a pointy top. And we'll find in some of the stories where Siwangmu interacts with people, these ritual objects made of jade are presented, usually as gifts from one side to the other. So, so jade is not just for long life, which is going to be important for when we're discussing this character, but it's also important for rituals and for government authority and things like that. I can share an interesting story about jade that's not entirely off topic. It shows that this is actually a very famous jade ritual object. It's the jade bee of Mr. He, or He Shi Bee. And basically, it's again a very ancient story. It's found in, I think the earliest record is a Han Fei Zi, which is going to be, 3rd century BC or something. But essentially there was a man called Mr. He, and he brought a stone, like an uncut jade, to the reigning monarch of the Zhou dynasty, which is a very ancient, pre-unification Chinese kingdom or dynasty. And he says, look, this is a giant piece of jade. And so the king passes it on to someone to inspect it. The person inspects it and says, no, it's not jade, it's just a rock. And so the king brings Mr. He back, or Master He back, and says, it's not jade, it's just a rock. And then he cuts off Mr. He's left foot. And then Mr. He goes home with his rock. So anyway, the king gets old, passes away. I guess he didn't have his jade. And then the next king takes the throne. And Mr. He comes back and says, look, I got the jade. And the king says, I'll inspect it again, see what it is. They inspect it, and again they say, it's just a stone. And so the king comes back and says, no, it's just a stone. You tried to trick me again. I'm going to cut off your other foot. And so he cuts off his right foot. And so Mr. He goes back. This time he has no feet, but he still has his jade. And the second monarch dies. So the third monarch comes to the throne. And instead of, well, he can't walk over there anymore, but instead of presenting himself to the king, Mr. He takes his lump of rock or jade and goes to a mountain and just starts crying. And he cries so much that blood flows instead of tears. And the third king hears about it and goes to talk to Mr. He and just says, you know, a lot of people have their feet cut off. Why are you being such a baby about it? Like, it's not a big deal. People always get their feet cut off when they do bad stuff. And then Mr. He said, I'm not sorry about my feet. I'm just sad that this precious and special material, this jade, is just called an ordinary stone, and an honest man is called a liar. And so the third king examines it. Turns out it really is jade, and everyone is now infatuated with this extremely expensive, ornate piece of jade that they form into a ritual object, and it kind of becomes one of those sort of ancient relic or special things for the period. But Mike, I see I gave you the microphone, so did you have anything to add or say?
No, I just needed to have a mic to be able to post that in the nest egg, that jade suit.
Gotcha. No worries. Thank you again for getting an image of that. Everyone will see I did put up a, and I see you just added it now. Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about when I said by the late Han era, these people have these full suits of jade. There's a lot of them, and that's a good example of one there. The you'll see I had an image up on the jumbotron as well when I started out. Essentially, these are two tiles from a tomb. Siwangmu. Again, this is a Han era tomb, but she's used to decorate tombs and funerary ornaments and things. So you can see her there as well. So as I'm kind of emphasizing with the jade here, she's strongly associated with something that involves long life or immortality, as well as the ritual objects and relics. But she's also, as we're going to see, associated with death. And on that point about death, seeing as just I'm kind of finishing up where she's located, but just keep in mind she's way out west, so that's where the sun sets. One of these texts at Arya, the ancient dictionary, one of the oldest sources for her, is saying that she lives on a westernmost wasteland. So she's not only just where the sun sets, it's a literal wasteland. And apparently there's a quicksand or, shifting sand river. It's kind of a dangerous place. So I think we can also associate her in somewhere with danger or death. And that'll become a bit more apparent when we talk about how to recognize or spot her. Like, what does she look like? So if we're trying to find her, we know her name. We know where she is. If we're in China, we got to kind of travel northwest or west to some mountain range and look for certain rivers. But and she also, just to be clear, when I say she lives on a mountain range, these texts say that she has like a stone home. So she's either living in a cave or some sort of stone structure or room on the mountain. But anyway, in terms of her appearance, if you want to spot her, the oldest account of her, like written account of her appearance, is again in that Shanhai Jing, that text that I described as a sort of atlas or a description of the natural world, or the world. I guess these things aren't natural. It describes her as like a human being, but she has the tail of a leopard. She has the teeth of a tiger. Her hair it's hard to understand the description, but let's just say it's like a messy hair, like a vine-like hair, and on her hair is a ornamental headdress called a sheng. It's not like this text has like a picture of the sheng, so I don't know exactly how it's supposed to be described, but she has some sort of fancy headdress on, and she makes the sound. It tries to describe the sound of her voice. It's like a roaring or a whistling. So she's got, leopard tail, tiger teeth, strange hair, some sort of fancy headdress, and she can roar or whistle. And it also says she's in charge of plagues and other disasters. So she has some sort of device or method where she controls like the diseases sent by heaven, or basically like the diseases that come upon man, and also the destruction of the elements or disasters. So there's some very strong association with danger again there, and death, obviously. She also has a little stool of some sort and a stick. So human-like person with these animal characteristics or appearances, makes a funny sound like a roaring or whistling. She has a stool and a stick. Maybe the stool is like something she sits on, and she can send plagues and disasters. This is the oldest account of her that describes her appearance. I did find, just to make it even clearer, in the Han Dynasty, there's a text called, I think this is from the Lun Heng. It's like a Confucian text, but the author, it's funny how we get this information. The author is trying to discuss whether or not certain signs or appearances mean that someone is immortal. And so the question is, should you think that someone is immortal if they have wings or feathers? And the reason he says that it doesn't necessarily follow is he says Siwangmu does not have wings or feathers. So we know that she does not have wings or feathers. And also implicit in that is this understanding that she lives forever. So I think that's a little interesting addition there. We know not to draw her with feathers or wings. There's later sources describing her. The Shanhai Jing is kind of unique in being that old and giving a written description of her appearance down to details like her teeth. But we get that little bit about the feathers and wings from a Han Dynasty text. We also have a poem. It's by a poet called Sima Xiangru, who lived in the early Han Dynasty. So we're talking, kind of like the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great, the successor states, or Diadochoi, or whatever they're called. He wrote a poem, and in the poem, a king, or we'll just say, I don't need to get into who it is, but basically the main character gets bored and wants to fly around the world and look at everything. And at one point, he's looking down and he sees Siwangmu, and he describes her as living in a cave. Her hair is white, and she has like a fancy headdress or hairpins, and a bird brings her food. And he knows that she lives forever. Now, he also says it's kind of boring living forever if you're going to be like that, but the point is he knows she lives forever, and he gives those descriptions of her. So we get a bit more information. Her hair is white in this example, and white. Some of the jade as well that we'll be seeing in her interactions with people is also white. So white jade seems to be particularly valuable or associated with her. There's another text from the early Han Dynasty, and it's the Jiao Shi Yilin, and it says that she has gold and iron teeth. So I don't know how we square that with the older account where she has the teeth of a tiger, unless those tigers' teeth, I guess, are made of gold and iron. But there you go. That text again says that Siwangmu lives without knowing old age. And we'll also see in some of these texts, when she's interacting with people, she has a jade flute. So you'll find that she, I don't know if she's associated with music from a very, very early stage, but maybe she has a flute. And in one of the earliest accounts of an interaction we have with her, she does sing. So even though the Shanhai Jing said that she roars and she whistles, or she has like a roaring whistle sound to her, um, not too long after that, we get texts where actually she's singing and she has a flute. So somehow she's either speaking with a roaring, whistling voice, or maybe she's been changed or developed in some way. And while we're on the appearance of her, because we got her name, we got the location, and now we're doing the appearance. I mentioned the original images I put up on the jumbotron. Again, those are from a grave from the Han Dynasty. Those pictures, I believe, it's from a museum in Chengdu somewhere. But if we look at it, you'll see that she's sitting. So she's the central figure, and she's seated on. It's kind of like an. It gets described as an animal throne, but you'll see that it's like some sort of strange beast, and she's sitting on it. Now, is that the stool that was described by the Shanhai Jing? I don't know, but if those animals are not alive, and I don't know the artist's intention or what the Han Dynasty people thought of it, but to me, I'm just wondering maybe the stool has some sort of animal motif to it. But you can also see to Siwangmu's left, you have a nine-tailed fox. That's another popular Chinese mythological creature. It's basically a fox with nine tails, but later on, just like Siwangmu develops and becomes a more complex character, we'll find that the nine-tailed fox also becomes a more complicated character. Actually, the nine-tailed fox, as we go, so in the Shanhai Jing, it's literally just a fox with nine tails. But later on in Han Dynasty and beyond, it now becomes like a special sort of nymph or spirit that can become a woman and seduces people. So now the nine-tailed fox has a whole different, like, well, not different, but a whole more. It's like a much more developed character in the Han Dynasty. And again, that's a Han Dynasty funeral decoration or tomb tile. It's like a tile from a tomb. And so it has a nine-tailed fox on it. In that time period, I would assume they believed that the fox could turn into a woman. And then you see a dancing frog in front of her. In both, yeah. Well, yeah, in both. There's a dancing frog in both of them in front of her. And then you have some people praying or offering her some sort of worship or respect. And there's a bird there as well. So I don't have much to say about the frog or the bird. She was worshipped widely in Han Dynasty, as we'll see. But it's just interesting. We have a visual depiction of her in Han times as well, because again, she was a popular decoration, I suppose, for tombs and funeral objects. And I have also read that there are, you know, how we get those Venus of Willendorf or those statues or whatnot of fertility goddesses they're described as. There may be, I haven't gone into the archaeological record or tried to find out what people have tried to tie to Siwangmu, but I understand that some people believe that some of those old female statues that they've dug up or icons that they've dug up, like depicted on stone, if it's a woman with an animal or something like that, they'll think it may be Siwangmu, like a very ancient depiction. But the one up there is from Han Dynasty. So I think at this point, we have her name. We understand the different ways it gets interpreted. We have her location, you know, far to the west or northwest in a mountain range in this dangerous, desolate area, and she lives in a cave up there. We have her appearance. It's like initially it's a very beast-like appearance with tiger teeth, leopard tail, strange, messy hair with a headdress. And she has this sort of stool or throne and a stick, and she can control the plague and death and, well, destruction, like natural disasters. And she has a lot of white jade. And so it's sort of like, how did people interact with her when they did find her, or did she find them? Like, how do they know about her? Because we have her location, description, and name, but what has she got to do with us? And so the last thing I wanted to do in this space was go over all of the, when I say all, it's not that much, that many, but I wanted to go over all of the truly ancient accounts of meetings with her that we have. So we're looking again from remote antiquity. We saw that people were writing Simu. Western Mother Simu. If that's equated with Siwangmu, we have them at least writing about her. But what sort of interactions do we have? And I think what we're going to find is that in remote antiquity, and even down to the period that, of written texts around the day of Plato, for example, we're not, well, actually, no, Plato is a little different, but let's say down to the period of, say, the Persian Wars, 6th century BC, right? Oh, that's 5th century BC. Around early 5th century BC, you're basically anything from early 5th century BC and before, you're not going to meet her. There's no books talking about people meeting her, at least that we don't have anymore today. We know that jade is being imported from that area. But, we know that she's in charge of like plagues and disasters and things, but nobody's really writing about their meetings with her. I didn't find anything from that time period where people had written an account. But by the time we get to the Warring States period, we do get a few. And again, Warring States period is where we're getting towards unification. And let's just say that the text I'm about to reference is around the time of Alexander the Great. Let's say around there. Basically, someone wrote a text called the Mu Tian Zi Zhuan. So it's going to be Son of Heaven Mu, a record. It's just like a record of the King Mu, the Son of Heaven's like journey or whatever. But literal translation is like the Son of Heaven Mu's like record or account. And essentially this document gets put in a burial. And then, 500 years later, someone digs it up in the Han Dynasty, and they say, "Oh, look, it's an ancient account of King Mu's visit to." Well, it's actually many stories about King Mu, but it contains this particular story about Siwangmu. So, how old is that text? If you believe that they dug it out of a burial site and they preserved it correctly and compiled it correctly, then it's Warring States period, right? But if you think that it's a Han era forgery, or you think they edited it too heavily, then obviously it's a Han era text. But this story is interesting. It's basically King Mu is from a pre-unification Chinese dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. King Mu is a very famous king of the Zhou dynasty. He's going to be living around the 10th century BC. So it's going to be sometime around the Iliad and Odyssey that we think of in terms of mythological history. This is like the Chinese period of that mythology. It's like kind of real. I believe Achilles and Agamemnon are real people, but it's also kind of mythological because it's extremely removed and fabulous, and the texts are much later. And so I don't want to just say that it's real history in that sense, in that it's well attested to all these details. But anyway, King Mu, he goes on a tour of the lands. He's accompanied by a great charioteer called Zhao Fu, who can, ride horses over long distances very quickly. And they go and explore the remote lands. And, he goes all the way west and he goes to the mountains and he's traveling around Kunlun Mountain. There's like a whole mountain range there. And eventually he meets Siwangmu. Now, the character Mu, just as an aside, I pulled this text and the character Mu is not the right character. So Xi Wang is the same characters. And then the character for Mu is very, very, very close. But it's pronounced differently. It's Wu. I don't know how they pronounce it in 3,000 years ago when King Mu was wandering around. But it's a very, very, very close written character. So I'm sure I know that in secondary sources and scholars, they equate this Siwangmu with a Siwang or XiWangMu. So they're saying it's the same thing. But just to be clear, in this text, that last character is written a little differently. But when you hear the story, I think you're going to say, yeah, it's the same person. And also, just to be clear, some people try and give this a very, I don't want to say secular, but very, it's like a doubting interpretation where, where you take a myth and you try to interpret it as what could have given a rise to the myth. So you'll say, for example, oh, centaurs aren't real. It's just a person walking, and there was a horse next to him, and someone was confused and said he was a horse person. And so in this one, they say, no, Siwangmu is not a creature. Sometimes if you read translations of this, sometimes this is what they'll do. They'll say Siwangmu is not a creature. It's a tribe. And so this story of King Mu, it's him visiting a tribe that uses certain totemic symbols. And so they'll translate the document as nothing to do with Siwangmu. They'll just say the tribe is called Siwangmu, and the rest of it will be about the chief said this, the priest said that, because they're reinterpreting it or interpreting it in a certain fashion. But I'm going to stick with the idea that this is a single entity, rather than try to go down that road. So basically, King Mu, he goes all the way out west on his grand tour. He reaches this mountain where he knows that Siwangmu is living at, and he goes up to the mountain to visit her. And what he does is he holds up a white jade gui, so a stick with like a pointy bit at the top, and it's made of white jade. Again, obviously, white jade very associated with Siwangmu. And he also holds a very dark jade bee, so a circular disc with a hole in it. So he's got this bright white ritual object made of white jade, and he's got this dark jade other ritual object. And, he walks up while holding these up in front of him. And then he gives Siwangmu, he also presents her with a large amount of silk and a large amount, 300 pieces of something else. The text is fragmentary, so we don't know what the other thing is. But we just know there was 300 of it. So basically 100 quantities of silk and 300 quantities of something. And actually Siwangmu is friendly. She repeatedly bows and thanks him and accepts the gifts. So actually she's very, very thankful. And those who would interpret this as being a tribe or trying to put a political interpretation on it would maybe interpret this as saying that Siwangmu is kind of recognizing King Mu's authority, right? And this is a gift from King Mu to her. Or you could interpret it as he had to pay respect to this divinity or this creature, and he had to hold his ritual objects up as he approached. But anyway, Duke, well, he's called Duke Mu often, but King Mu, he goes down the mountain and he rests there. And then the next day, he invites Siwangmu to a party. I would say a tea party, but they don't have tea at this time. But but like a party by the lake. So they set out some food and drink, and Siwangmu agrees to attend. Now, keep in mind, in this text, Siwangmu is not described. So does she have tiger teeth and a leopard tail? That's not part of the story. She's just Siwangmu. So she comes down from the mountain, and they have a nice party. They get along well, and they start singing. And actually, what's really nice about this text is it preserves the words that she sang. Now, it's difficult to translate Chinese poetry. I'm nowhere near a good translator. So I pulled it, I looked at it, I saw some translations. I'm going to read out what Siwangmu said, but I would emphasize that sometimes it's difficult to know who a sentence applies to. And so if you think it applies to Siwangmu, you would interpret it one way. And if you think it applies to the king, you could interpret it another way. I don't think it makes any sort of irreconcilable like contradiction or something that ruins a story, but it's just interesting that even though I'm going to read this poem, just keep in mind it's difficult to translate. It doesn't always indicate who is the subject of a sentence, and so if you read a different translation someday, it may look different. But the first song that she sings, they're at the party, they've eaten and had drinks, and they're getting along, and it's winding down, and she sings, "White clouds are in the heavens, mountains and mounds emerge of their own accord. Our ways and byways are distant and far off. Mountains and rivers separate them." if I take you and make you deathless, perhaps you'll be able to come here again. And so that was the first song that she sings to the king. And I think it's, I think what really stands out to me there, because it's going to go to her appearance or characteristics, is that she says, if I take you and make you deathless. So previously we mentioned, Jade is associated with long life or immortality. We had certain things associated with death or danger, like the plague and the shifting sands and all of that. But now we have her in this, what I believe, I'm just going to believe the story. It was buried with a person and dug up later and correctly preserved. What we have here is a pre-unification Chinese text that's after the Shanhai Jing, but before, unification, so it's still very ancient, probably around the time of Alexander the Great or Aristotle or something. And she's saying, if I take you and make you deathless. So she's not just associated with life and death, she's also associated with the ability to make someone else live forever. And we can translate that sentence different ways, but she's basically telling the king, I either am making you I am making you live forever, or if I make you live forever. And so she's clearly able to give this sort of immortality to people. And so then the king sings back to her, I will return home to the eastern earth to harmonize and set in order the various Chinese tribes. When the myriad people are peaceful and equitable, I will turn my head back to see you. 3 years from now, I will return to this wild place. So, we get this story from later sources as well. And essentially, King Mu finds out that during his journey, things have become, less than stable back at home. So he's going to have to go back home. And he is going to have to, as he says, harmonize and set in order the various Chinese tribes. When the myriad people are peaceful and equitable, I'll turn my head back to see you. So he's going to have to go home and take care of business. But he's saying he'll come back. And he calls it a wild place. And so remember, we're associating Siwangmu with all these wild animals. She has a leopard tail, tiger teeth, an animal throne. She's fed by birds, things like that. So it's a wild land. It's sort of like, I think it's interesting that he describes it as this wild place or this wildland. Anyway, after this, the party's over. And the next day or shortly afterwards, the king climbs up one of the nearby mountains and he carves on the mountain XiWangMu mountain. So I guess he names the mountain. He carves into the stone. It's the mountain of Siwangmu. And he plants a tree there. And then after he's planted his tree and done his, labeling or carving onto the mountain, he leaves. And as he's leaving, Siwangmu appears and sings to him. And again, you have the provisos with regard to the accuracy of the translation. It's difficult, but what we get is, where do I have the poem? No, I need to go find the, hold on, I'm going to have to pull up the poem. All right, here we go. White clouds are in the heavens. Oh, wait, no, that's a beginning poem. Hold on, I got a copy here somewhere that I did. All right, this is my... Proceeding northwards, you came to these countries of the west, and here you dwelled in these wilds, where tigers and leopards rove about in herds, and crows and magpies share the place with them. Fortune's destiny is fixed unalterably for me as well as for you, the king. Great is your destiny as the son of heaven, yet it cannot be pronounced. Implication is to be perfect. The world's people, moved by sympathy. Oh, this is a guy who was interpreting it as a tribe. Yeah, the people moved by sympathy shed tears over the sudden fall which threatens the king. They blow the reed pipes and place the organ to drown out the grief of their hearts. The people can only look to heaven in expectation or hope. As an example of what makes these difficult, you'll see this poem starts with proceeding northwards, you came to these countries of the west, and here you dwelled in these wilds, where tigers and leopards rove about in herds, and crows and magpies share the place with them. Okay, I'm not going to doubt that you can have that reading if you assume that Duke Mu is the subject of the sentence proceeding northward, you came to these countries of the west, and the stuff about dwelling where tigers and leopards and magpies are. But if you interpret that as referring to Siwangmu, actually she's saying that she is going to go further to the west, and she is going to dwell in the western wildlands, and that when we get to the sentence where tigers and leopards rove about in herds, and crows and magpies share the place with them, depending on what you take to be the subject or how you fit that sentence together, you could say that Siwangmu is like the tigers and leopards are going to be in her herd, and the crows and magpies will live with that herd. So now you have an interpretation. I mean, the first interpretation, fine. The Duke came to the west. He lived in the wildlands and he saw the tigers and leopards and magpies and crows. That's pretty good. It fits in with everything. I'm happy with that. Or you could have it, Siwangmu is forming a herd with the tigers and leopards, and the crows and magpies are living with them. So now she's even more animalistic, like she's living with these wild beasts, and the birds are, just like we have sections where birds feed her, the birds are dwelling with her herd as well. So she's like a woman who's living with a herd of tigers and leopards and followed around by birds, which, is a simple enough interpretation to make if you just take a different subject for the sentence or change the grammar. And again, it's not like the grammar is set in stone or it's stating who is the subject. But what really stands out to me, kind of the metaphysics of of the sentence, in that first poem that she's saying, she showed that she could make the king live forever. In this last song that she sings, she's saying, fortune is fixed unalterably for me and for you. So it's like a statement on fate almost. And she's saying, as great as your destiny is, as great as you are, it's not perfect, and you can't avoid it. And there's threats to be faced, which goes into why he's returning east, I suppose. But I think that's also an interesting little comment on spirituality or metaphysics there, where she's saying, that we have a fixed destiny, it can't be altered. You have to go face these dangers. Although perhaps in making him live forever, she's kind of changing his fate, or maybe that is his fate. But anyway, we can go down. This story is the oldest one where a person is actually going off to see her and having any sort of real interaction with her. Again, from Warring States period. And this story gets repeated in a few other sources. So in there's a Taoist text. Again, some say it's pre-unification. Some say it's like a heavily edited document. Again, it's an amalgamation of essays. It's called the Liezi. And if you look at the chapter Zhou Mu Wang, so I guess the king of Zhou, there's a story about a magician that visits King Mu. And when he visits King Mu, he's not impressed by him. And King Mu kind of wishes he was impressed and keeps inviting him to hang out. And the magician at some point, I don't want to get too much into the story because Siwangmu is not the point of the story, but the magician at some point just goes, screw it, I'm going to take you on an outing. And basically gives him a magic carpet ride up into the heavens and shows him all sorts of fabulous things and experiences. And one of those experiences is King Mu goes to Siwangmu's house and attends a party there. And Siwangmu sings a very moving song for him, and he sings back to her. So if we take the Liezi, we can take it either as an ancient text or as a Han Dynasty amalgamation or forgery of some sort. But basically, it's a very, very similar story. He gets there in a different fashion. It's a lot less elaborate. The party is at Siwangmu's house, so presumably at her cave. But again, they're singing to each other, and it's very moving. And King Mu thinks it's an amazing experience. But that's, the rest of the story is not so much Siwangmu is not really the point of it. She's just one of the amazing experiences that the wizard gives him. Um, you know, in terms of oh, man, I was remiss in missing this. I'm just looking at a note I had here from the Zhuangzi. So everyone knows Zhuangzi because if you like Taoism, you like Lao Tzu and you like Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is an ancient pre-unification text. Let's again say the successor states to Alexander the Great, sometime around there. He mentions Siwangmu, and he says that Siwangmu gained her power or her place because she understood how to she understood the way, or she understood the Tao. So she's very wise and understands how nature works. Um, that's kind of that should have been earlier in this talk about her appearance or her characteristics, but the I didn't want to leave that out because it's a major source as well. The As we go to the next, so we have the story of Duke Mu recorded as well in the Liezi. We have also a few short accounts that I want to give just before I go to the final one, which I'll end on. And the final one I'll end on is kind of long, but not as long as the one we had with Duke Mu, so it shouldn't take too long. Before I get to it, there's a Han Dynasty text where a king is wanting to do better. He wants to conquer some land from a neighbor. Actually, the Han Dynasty text is talking about remote antiquity, basically spring and autumn period. A very famous figure in the spring and autumn period. So it's a Han history book looking back like 600 years or whatever. And the king wants to conquer his neighbor and do better and become more powerful, but he doesn't know the steps to take. And he gets advice, and the advice is very Machiavellian or realpolitik. But the first bit of advice is to be pious. So at least the first bit of advice we can kind of respect and honor without thinking that it's sort of underhanded. But so to be pious, what does he do? He sets up a shrine. He sets up two shrines, actually. He sets up a shrine to Siwangmu, and they worship her. And he also sets up a shrine to a figure called Dong Huang Gong. So like the Eastern emperor guy, We'll also find in later myths that Dong Huang Gong is kind of associated with Siwangmu as sort of a husband figure. And in later myths, I know that Siwangmu is portrayed as the wife of the Jade Emperor and other figures. I don't want to get too much into those later myths, but just be aware that there is this Eastern Emperor guy who also gets worshipped. And in Han Dynasty, you see them next to each other as having their areas of worship or set up for them. We also have two other texts, Da Dai Li Ji and Zhong Lun, and it has Siwangmu. Very short. She just she comes to court. She says hello and she gives people gifts. What gift does she give? In the one text, she shows up and she gives a gift of a white jade flute. So again, she has a flute. She's not singing, but she's giving over this jade flute. And in the other story, what does she give? She gives a white jade ring. So again, she's giving these jade ritual objects. Well, I guess a flute is an instrument, but she's giving jade as gifts. So we started this out like, how do people meet her? Because we're going to have a big change now when we get to this final story. But what did we have here? We had initially people don't meet her. She controls plagues and disasters. She lives in a remote, dangerous area. You don't go meet her. At some point, Duke Mu, again, it's like a Homeric era, semi-historical king, goes to visit her. And actually, she's kind of welcoming. She's very beast-like and wild and strange, but she's welcoming. So I guess if you're a king with a lot of money and you're amazingly powerful, yeah, you can go visit her. So we've gone from nobody visit her, all right, special heroic people can visit her. And now she's actually visiting us and giving the king a gift of a flute or a ring. She's going down to the imperial court to present these things. So now she's kind of a gift giver. But in the last one, she's now finally going to present herself to all of humanity. Specifically, if we go to right to the beginning of the current era, so we're looking at like we know this story is recorded in a couple of texts. The version I'm going off of is an essay attached to the Han Shu. I don't know if there's a translation of it. I couldn't find a translation of it, so I don't have one to share, but I read it. Um, and I'll give you the details. But I don't think there's a translation for this, unfortunately. But if you did want to look this up and you did want to go searching for a translation, you'd find it in the Hanshu and in the Qian Hanji. But the Hanshu has been translated, but this is an essay that gets appended as a commentary to the end of it. So I had to go read it myself and wrestle with it. But anyway, this is where she now becomes open to everyone. So around 7 to 1 BC, that's when this emperor is reigning. So 7 BC to 1 BC. This emperor, not doing a great job. Actually, we'll find out that the Western Han, collapses within a generation of this. And you wind up with a very short-lived dynasty that takes over. And then the Han reestablishes itself. But this is a time of civil strife and disaster. And this particular emperor, he's 7 BC to 1 BC. And he has like a very prominent or respected grandmother or mother. And so, she is well known. And it'll become obvious why I say that later. But anyway, the essentially civil strife, everything's going wrong. Siwangmu is worshipped in court and is worshipped by the common people. The text says that it has common people and rulers worshipping her, but everything's going badly. And so the people get together. They're out in the provinces, and they build a shrine, and then they offer a sacrifice, and they dance and they sing to Siwangmu in worship of her. And she actually responds to them. These are just common people, and she responds to them. And she tells them that if you wear my writing, you will have life without death. You'll live forever. It's literally life without death if we were doing a literal translation. She said, if you wear my words or my writing, usually translated as like a little talisman or like a piece of paper you can wear on you, like in your pocket or something like that. Write down the words as a symbol and put them on your clothing or hold them or carry them in some way. If you do that with her words, they will have life without death. And for those that doubt her, she says they should go and they should look under the hinges of the doors because they'll find white hair there. And remember when we read that poem from the Han Dynasty, it was white hair that was described. Siwangmu was described as having white hair. And so there you have it. She comes down to people who are worshipping her, and she says, I'll give you eternal life if you wear my words or you carry my words. And if you doubt me, just look under the doors. You'll find white hair. And so, of course, they do or whatever. Anyway, the Han Dynasty did collapse. A new dynasty took over for one generation. I think it's a very, very entertaining period of history, that dynasty and that figure, Wang Mang. But his dynasty immediately collapses and Han reasserts itself. And the author of these books, or this commentary essay, again, this story about offering eternal life in exchange for carrying her writing, they interpret it as, obviously they don't like these rebels, because these people, it's a time of civil strife and trying to do something new, and the whole dynasty collapses. They say that this story is really about the king's grandmother. It is his grandmother, trying to meddle in politics and try to make people think that Siwangmu will help them or something like that. And actually, some of these commentators say, how ridiculous. White hair, that's not auspicious. White hair is like an old lady. It means that things are going to die. And imagine having an old Siwangmu, old lady, or some female in charge of government. That's ridiculous. They can't do it. That's literally from the essay. I don't want to say it's a word for word translation, but he's basically saying women can't rule, and white hair means like it's old and decrepit and it's going to fail. Of course, the other interpretation would be that the white hair is the jade, right? But anyway, that's the final story that I wanted to end on, and I have not read about Siwangmu beyond that. Everything I've said, it's drawn from the primary source material. But again, I didn't look beyond the Han Dynasty for primary source material. I just ended it there. And I think one of the shortcomings of what I've done is I haven't really had the time or ability, or even really inclination, I guess, to pull all of the archaeological record and find all of the depictions. So I would suggest to someone who wants to add to this or to know more about Siwangmu, you sort of had two directions. One is you can go and start pulling all of the physical depictions that we've dug up or recovered, because it's going to give you more of an idea of what she looked like or the animals that she associates with and things like that. And I think this is my suspicion, but I think that there's got to be, this motif of like a woman with wild animals, or a dangerous woman out in the wild. That's not unique. I'm not that well versed in mythology, so I can't. I mean, one example I think is like Artemis or Thea. Like, what is she doing? She's like a hunter woman, and she's holding like dead birds and stuff. And I want to say there's a lot of depictions of similar gods or goddesses where it's like a female hunter goddess or some sort of wild goddess, and she's like holding animals that she's caught, or she's flanked by animals. And isn't Artemis or Diana always flanked by animals? So I think maybe if you go down that route of pulling physical depictions or descriptions of other goddesses as well, and seeing what we've dug up or what portraits have been physically carved into tombs and things of Siwangmu, you might add and flesh out the story more that way. And the other way is you go forward and you read texts that come after the Han Dynasty. But I think if you do that, you're going to see that Siwangmu is going to change even more. Because even in this like a brief space, I can't see how long the space has gone, but even in this brief time, she's gone from a very unapproachable, wild-looking, half human, half animal controller of plagues and death, but also Jade and eternal life, to a character that's coming down to see the people and saying, "Hey, carry my words with you, and you'll live forever." And presenting courts with presents and entertaining kings. And then if you go to medieval, she's going to be the wife of some other god, or there are various other rebellions that crop up where again she's a savior figure where they think that she'll protect her and give them eternal life. So she's almost like a perennial. She almost becomes like a perennial savior. She keeps coming back, and the rebellion fails, is my understanding. But that's the other direction to go, to read about her medieval developments and see how the character develops. And I think she goes in a number of different directions. That's sort of well beyond my understanding. I haven't read any sort of post-Han material, and it's kind of outside my wheelhouse anyway. There's so much stuff out there. But for anyone that is interested in Siwangmu, those are my two suggestions. Pull the physical findings or that we've recovered through archaeology, and also go pull the medieval texts and maybe some modern texts as well, and see how people came to worship her in the thousands of years that followed the Han Dynasty. But at that, I'm gonna call it there. That's all the material I wanted to cover. That's literally all that I could learn about her, based solely on the ancient texts from Han and earlier. If anyone has any quick questions, just let me know. Ask for the mic. Otherwise, I'll end it there. All right. Well, I thank you all for listening. I thought it would be a waste to let all this research just go to the wayside without making a space and presenting it. And it's recorded, so thankfully, it's saved. And if I ever want to go back and remind myself of all these little details, or if anyone else down the road needs to learn more about Siwangmu from a strictly ancient perspective, please feel free to give it a listen. And if you are listening and this is now the future, hello, I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.